Training for hours every day. What keeps you motivated?
Discipline and awareness.
Oh, my goodness. You stopped that an inch.
A fist stopped 1 inch from a man's chest. Just 1 inch. The arm didn't pull back. It didn't wind up. It just fired forward. The man flew backward off his feet, crashed into a chair, and hit the floor hard. The crowd went silent. 8,000 people in that auditorium, and not one of them made a single sound. The guy on the floor was no amateur. He was a trained martial artist. 200 pounds. Solid. And he'd just been launched by a punch that traveled less distance than a credit card is wide. The man standing over him weighed 140 pounds. 5'7". Thin arms. No bulk. He looked like a college kid who skipped the gym. His name was Bruce Lee. What did he do next that made a world karate champion freeze in total shock? Stay with me on this one. To understand what happened that day, you need to know what Bruce Lee walked into. It was August 1964. The Long Beach Municipal Auditorium in California. Ed Parker, one of the biggest names in American karate, had organized the first international karate championships. This was the real deal. Over 800 competitors. Thousands of spectators. Black belts from every discipline you can name. Judo, karate, taekwondo, kempo. These were serious fighters with serious reputations. And into that crowd walked Bruce Lee. Now here's the thing. Nobody knew who he was. Not really. He was 23 years old. He'd been teaching Wing Chun Kung Fu out of a small school in Seattle, then another in Oakland. He had a handful of students. No TV credits. No film roles. No tournament wins. In the world of American martial arts, he was a nobody. Ed Parker had invited him to give a demonstration. Not to compete. Just to show what Chinese martial arts could do. Most of the audience didn't care. They were there for the tournaments, the trophies, the fighters they already knew. When this skinny kid from Hong Kong walked out onto the stage, the reaction was somewhere between curiosity and indifference. Lee didn't look like a fighter. That was the first problem. In 1964, martial artists were expected to be big, thick, muscular. The guys in that auditorium had forearms like tree branches and necks like fire hydrants. Lee looked like he could blow away in a strong wind. 140 pounds on a good day. Thin wrists, narrow shoulders. The kind of build that gets you overlooked in any room full of athletes. A few people in the crowd actually laughed. Not loud, not mean. Just that kind of quiet dismissal you give to something that doesn't seem worth your time. Lee didn't react. He stepped onto the stage with a calm that bordered on boredom. No warm-up, no stretching, no dramatic entrance. He just walked out, stood still, and waited for the noise to settle. Ed Parker had assigned one of his own students, a young Filipino martial artist named Dan Inosanto, to be Lee's guide for the event. Inosanto had been skeptical too. He'd trained in multiple fighting styles. He knew what real skill looked like. And this kid from Seattle didn't fit the profile. Then Lee started moving. He began with something simple, push-ups, but not regular push-ups. He dropped to the floor and did them on 2 fingers. Not 5, not 3, 2. His thumb and his index finger. 1 hand. His body rigid as a plank, rising and falling with total control. The laughter stopped. Then he moved to speed drills. He had a volunteer stand in front of him and try to block a punch. Lee told the man exactly what he was going to do. Straight punch. Right hand. To the face. Block it. That's all you have to do. The volunteer nodded. Lee stepped back. Then he moved. His fist reached the man's face before the man's hands even started to rise. They tried it again. Same result. Again. Same result. 8 times in a row, and the volunteer never came close to blocking a single strike. The auditorium shifted. You could feel it. That background hum of casual attention turned into something else. Focus. People leaned forward. Conversations stopped. 8,000 people started paying attention to the skinny kid from Hong Kong. But the real moment hadn't come yet. Lee called for another volunteer, a bigger one this time, Bob Baker, 200 pounds, a student of Lee's, but a serious martial artist in his own right. Baker stood facing Lee. Lee extended his right arm until his fist was about 1 inch from Baker's chest. 1 inch. Lee didn't pull back, didn't wind up, didn't shift his feet. He just stood there with his fist hovering against Baker's chest. And then he punched. Baker flew. Not stumbled. Flew. His feet left the floor. He crashed backward into a chair that had been placed behind him to prevent injury, and the momentum carried him off the chair and onto the ground. Baker would later say he had to stay home from work because the pain in his chest was unbearable. From a punch that traveled 1 inch. The auditorium erupted. Not polite applause. Not respectful clapping. A roar. The kind of sound that only comes when thousands of people see something they cannot explain. In the crowd, a hairdresser named Jay Sebring watched with his mouth open. Sebring had a client, a television producer named William Dozier. Dozier was looking for a Chinese actor for a new action series. Within weeks, Sebring had shown Dozier the footage from Long Beach. Within months, Bruce Lee had a television role. The Green Hornet, the career that would change everything. But first, there was something else Lee needed to prove. Something bigger. And the man who would force that proof was already in the room. 3 years later, Bruce Lee came back to Long Beach. It was 1967, the International Karate Championships again. Same auditorium, same crowd of elite fighters, but everything else had changed. Lee was no longer a nobody. He'd played Kato on the Green Hornet. He'd been on national television. Millions of Americans had watched him kick through doors and take down criminals with moves that looked like they'd been sped up in post-production. Except they hadn't been. The show's producers actually had to ask Lee to slow down because the cameras couldn't capture his movements at normal speed. His hands were literally too fast for film. But fame brought something Lee hadn't expected. Doubt. Not from the general public. From martial artists. The very people who should have understood what he was doing were the ones who questioned it most. See, in the 1960s, martial arts in America was a closed world. Rigid. Traditional. You picked a style and you stayed in it. Karate. Judo. Taekwondo. Each school had its rules, its forms, its hierarchy. And Lee was breaking all of them. He was mixing styles. Taking what worked from Wing Chun, boxing, fencing, wrestling, and throwing away what didn't. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. To traditional martial artists, it was heresy. They said he was a showman, an actor, a guy who looked good on camera but couldn't handle a real fighter. They said his demonstrations were staged, that his speed was exaggerated, that the volunteers in his demos were going along with it for the cameras. Now here's where it gets interesting. At the 1967 championships, one of the biggest names in American karate was a man named Vic Moore. He was a 4-time world karate champion, the first African-American to win a major national karate title. Fast, powerful, experienced. The kind of fighter who had earned every belt through blood and sweat and years of competition. Moore didn't think much of Lee's demonstrations. Not because he had anything personal against him. He just didn't believe that anybody was that fast. He'd fought the best in the world. He knew what speed looked like. And the claims about Lee's unstoppable punch sounded like Hollywood. Lee spotted Moore in the crowd. He walked over, and he asked Moore a question that would change both their lives. "Would you help me with a demonstration?" Moore agreed. He figured it would be quick. A bit of stage business between two professionals. Nothing serious. Lee explained the drill. It was simple. Lee would throw a straight punch to Moore's face. All Moore had to do was block it. That's it. Block the punch. One punch. One block. Moore had been blocking punches from world-class fighters for over a decade. He had reflexes sharpened by thousands of hours of competitive sparring. He had fought men who were faster, stronger, and heavier than Bruce Lee. This should have been the easiest thing he'd done all day. He had no reason to think otherwise. Lee stepped back. The auditorium went quiet. Thousands of martial artists leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore. This was a test. A world karate champion against the man who claimed to have the fastest hands alive. Lee asked if Moore was ready. Moore nodded. Lee moved. His fist reached Moore's face before Moore's hands had time to react. The punch stopped just short of contact. Clean. Untouched. Unblocked. Moore blinked. His hands hadn't moved. Not slow. They just hadn't started. They tried again. Same result. Lee's hand was there and back before Moore could close the gap. It was as if Lee existed in a different time frame. Again. And again. 8 times Lee threw the punch. 8 times Moore failed to block it. Not one of those 8 attempts produced anything close to a successful block. Believe me when I say this. Vic Moore was not a slow man. He was a champion. His reflexes were elite. He had spent his entire adult life training his body to react in fractions of a second. And he couldn't touch Lee's hand. Not once. Not even close. The crowd lost its mind. People were standing, shouting, pointing. Some of them were shaking their heads because they simply could not process what they had just seen. A 140-pound man from Hong Kong had just made a world karate champion look like he was moving in slow motion. But Lee wasn't done. He moved to the 1-inch punch demonstration. New volunteer. Bigger target. Same setup as 1964. Fist extended. 1 inch from the chest. No wind-up. No room. He punched. The volunteer went airborne. Same as before. Same impossible physics. A body launched by a fist that barely moved. Then came the blindfolded sparring. Lee had someone tie a cloth over his eyes. Complete darkness. His sparring partner, Dan Inosanto, was told to attack freely. Use anything. Punches. Kicks. Sweeps. Whatever he wanted. What followed was something the audience had never seen. Lee blocked strikes he couldn't see. He read his opponent's movements through touch and sound alone. He countered with sweeps and takedowns, using only contact sensitivity and instinct. He moved through the drill like the blindfold wasn't there. At one point, he caught Inosanto's arm mid-strike and redirected it into a takedown so smooth it looked rehearsed. It wasn't. By the time it was over, the auditorium was a different place. The skeptics were quiet. The doubters had nothing left to say. Lee had answered every question with action. No arguments. No speeches. Just performance that left no room for debate. Afterward, Lee sat backstage with Dan Inosanto and a few friends. Someone handed him a glass of water. He took a sip, leaned back, and exhaled like a man who just finished a long day at work. Inosanto asked him how he felt. Lee shrugged. He looked almost bored. Like what he'd just done was nothing special. Like it was Tuesday. The tension was gone. The crowd was filing out. The auditorium was emptying. A few reporters milled around looking for quotes. Lee loosened his collar and talked quietly with Inosanto about training schedules. For a moment, it looked like the story was over. Like the legend had done his thing and now everyone could go home. Nobody knew what was coming next. A man appeared at the edge of the backstage area. Big. Military big. Crew cut. Thick neck. The kind of build you get from years of combat training, not gym work. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood there, arms crossed, staring at Lee with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and contempt. Then he opened his mouth. "That's cute," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Real cute. You want to try that on someone who actually fights?" The room went still. Lee looked up from his water. He didn't stand. He didn't tense. He just looked at the man the way you'd look at a waiter who brought the wrong order. Calm. Patient. Mildly curious. The man stepped closer. He was at least 6 feet tall. Maybe 220. The kind of person who fills a doorway. He explained, without anyone asking, that he'd been watching the demonstration. He said the volunteers were compliant. Said any good martial artist could make a willing partner look slow. Said the one-inch punch worked because the target was standing still and cooperating. Now, this wasn't new. Lee had heard these arguments before. Every skeptic said the same thing. The demos are staged. The volunteers are in on it. It looks good for the cameras, but it wouldn't work on someone who was actually trying to hurt you. Lee had heard it in Oakland. He'd heard it in Seattle. He'd heard it from traditional kung fu masters who thought he was a disgrace to their art. The words changed, but the argument never did. But this man wasn't just talking. He was challenging. And the way he was doing it, loud and public, with people watching and listening, left Lee with very few options. Walk away and confirm every doubt. Or stand and answer. Inosanto stepped forward. He knew the look. He'd seen Lee deal with challengers before. In Oakland, when the Chinese martial arts community had tried to shut down his school. In Seattle, where fighters had shown up unannounced to test him. This was not Lee's first time facing someone who wanted to prove something. Lee stood up slowly. He put the glass of water on a table. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at the man, measuring, not with anger, with calculation. "What's your name?" Lee asked. The man gave it. It doesn't matter what it was. What matters is what happened next. Lee stepped forward until he was within arm's reach. The man didn't back up. If anything, he leaned in. He outweighed Lee by 80 pounds. He had reach, mass, and the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight that counted. Lee held up his hand, palm open. He placed it flat against the man's chest. Not a punch, not a strike, just his open palm, resting lightly against the bigger man's sternum. "Push me," Lee said. The man frowned. He didn't understand. "Push me," Lee repeated. "As hard as you can. Try to move me. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button." Because what happened in the next 10 seconds is something that 3 eyewitnesses described the exact same way, word for word. The man pushed. He put his weight into it. His legs drove forward. His arms extended. 220 pounds of trained muscle driving into a man who weighed 140. Lee didn't move. Not an inch. His feet stayed planted. His body absorbed the force like it was nothing. The big man's face changed. The amusement vanished. In its place was something closer to confusion. Before the man could reset, Lee moved his palm. Not a punch. A push. But the physics of it defied everything the big man knew about force and leverage. Lee's palm connected with a short, sharp motion. The man stumbled backward. Not gently. He hit a wall 6 feet behind him. His back slammed against it and his eyes went wide. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at Lee like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. "Again?" Lee asked. The man said nothing. He straightened his shirt. He looked at the faces around him. Inosanto, the stage crew, a couple of reporters who had just witnessed the whole thing. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was mocking. They were watching with the kind of quiet that follows something extraordinary. The man turned and walked away. No insult. No comeback. No challenge to fight. Just a large, confident man walking away from a much smaller one because he had felt something he couldn't argue with. His shoulders were different. The swagger was gone. He walked like a man who had just learned something he didn't want to know. This is where the story changes nature. Up to this point, it had been about skill, speed, technique. Bruce Lee as a performer, a demonstrator, a man who could dazzle a crowd with physical feats. But that moment backstage shifted something. It wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about power. Real, undeniable, physical power that worked on the unwilling and the unprepared just as well as it worked on volunteers. Word spread. Fast. The story traveled through the martial arts community like a brushfire. Not just the demonstrations, which were impressive enough on their own, but the backstage encounter. The big man who challenged Lee and walked away silent. The palm that couldn't be resisted. Within days, the narrative around Bruce Lee had changed. He wasn't just fast. He wasn't just a showman. He was something else. Something that traditional martial artists didn't have a category for. A man who could back up every single thing he'd ever claimed, against anyone at any time, willing or not. And the people who had doubted him the loudest were now the quietest people in the room. The footage from Long Beach changed everything. Not just for Lee, for martial arts, for Hollywood, for the entire way the Western world understood fighting. Before Long Beach, Kung Fu was a curiosity. An exotic thing from old Chinese movies that most Americans had never seen and didn't take seriously. After Long Beach, it was undeniable. The 1964 footage was filmed on a 16mm camera. 8.5 minutes of grainy, shaky film that captured something the martial arts world had never seen. Lee's two-finger push-ups. The speed drills where nobody could block him. The one-inch punch that sent Bob Baker airborne. That footage became the most important 8 minutes in martial arts history. Jay Sebring, the hairdresser who had been in the audience, showed the film to William Dozier within weeks. Dozier was a television producer. He'd been looking for a Chinese actor to star in an action series. He'd been thinking along the lines of a Chinese James Bond. Suave, sophisticated, capable. He hadn't found anyone who fit. Then he watched the Long Beach footage. Dozier didn't see a martial artist. He saw a star. The speed, the precision, the total control. The way Lee moved, like every part of his body was connected to a single explosive purpose. Dozier brought Lee to Los Angeles for a screen test. He paid him $1,800 and put him under contract. The Green Hornet premiered in September 1966. Lee played Kato, the hero's sidekick. On paper, he was second billing. In practice, he was the reason people tuned in. Nobody watched the show for the Green Hornet. They watched it for Kato. Lee's fight scenes were unlike anything American television had ever aired. The producers had to repeatedly tell him to slow down because his movements were so fast they blurred on camera. The director wanted him to fight in the typical American style with big looping punches. Lee refused. He insisted on fighting with authentic martial arts technique. Think about that. The cameras, which were designed to capture rapid motion, could not keep up with his hands. They actually had to ask the fastest man on the set to be slower so the audience at home could see what he was doing. But here's the thing about being fast. Speed only matters if it carries force. Plenty of fighters can throw quick punches that don't land with any weight behind them. Lee was different. His speed and his power were the same thing. The one-inch punch proved it. A fist that travels 1 inch should not generate enough force to launch a 200-pound man off his feet. According to the laws of physics as most people understood them, it was impossible. But Lee understood something that most fighters didn't. Power doesn't come from the arm. It comes from the entire body. When Lee threw the one-inch punch, his legs drove into the floor. His hips rotated. His shoulder lurched forward. His arm extended. And his wrist snapped at the exact moment of contact. All of that motion, coordinated to fire in sequence within a fraction of a second, compressed into a single inch of travel. A biomechanics researcher at Stanford University later studied the punch and confirmed what Lee had always known. The force didn't come from muscle. It came from coordination, timing, the ability to make every part of the body contribute to a single, focused moment of impact. That's why the big man backstage couldn't resist the palm push. It wasn't about Lee's arm strength. It was about his ability to channel the force of his entire body through a single point of contact, faster than anyone could brace for it. The Long Beach demonstrations had another consequence that Lee didn't anticipate. They made him enemies. Traditional martial artists, the ones who had spent decades mastering specific styles, saw Lee as a threat. He was publicly mixing techniques, taking what he wanted from any discipline, discarding the rest. He stood on stages and criticized classical forms, called them rigid, outdated, ineffective. In the Chinese martial arts community, this was unforgivable. Lee had already caused controversy by teaching non-Chinese students, white students, black students, anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of race or background. The traditional schools saw this as a betrayal of their culture and their customs. When Lee opened his school in Oakland, a group of traditional kung fu practitioners issued a challenge. The terms were clear. If Lee lost the fight, he would have to shut his school down and stop teaching non-Chinese students forever. If he won, he could teach whoever he wanted. Lee accepted. The fight happened behind closed doors. Only a handful of people witnessed it. According to Lee and those present, he won. But the fight lasted longer than he expected, and he was frustrated with his own performance. That frustration drove him to develop Jeet Kune Do, to strip away everything that was decorative and keep only what was effective. Function over form, results over tradition. The 1967 Long Beach demonstration was the public proof that his approach worked. Vic Moore, a world champion, couldn't block his punches. Bob Baker, a trained fighter, couldn't withstand his 1-inch punch. The blindfolded sparring showed that his instincts were so refined that he didn't even need to see his opponent to control the fight. And the backstage confrontation proved the final point. Lee's skills worked on the unwilling, on the skeptical, on the hostile. You didn't have to cooperate for his techniques to overwhelm you. You just had to be within range. By the end of 1967, the word was out. Bruce Lee was not a trick. He was not a showman. He was not a Hollywood creation. He was the real thing, and anyone who doubted it was welcome to stand in front of him and find out for themselves. The invitations stopped coming. The challenges dried up. The skeptics found other topics to argue about, because nobody wanted to be the next person standing 1 inch away from Bruce Lee's fist. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. In the 9 years between that first Long Beach demonstration and his death, he changed the world. That's not an exaggeration. He changed the way people fight, the way people train, the way people think about what the human body can do. Before Lee, martial arts in the West was a niche interest, something practiced in basements and strip mall dojos by a relatively small number of enthusiasts. After Lee, it was a global phenomenon. Millions of people around the world took up martial arts because of him. Not because of his movies, though those certainly helped. Because of what he proved. That a small man could be more powerful than a big man. That speed and technique could overcome size and brute force. That the human body, properly trained and properly coordinated, was capable of things that looked like they belonged in a comic book. He changed the way people thought about what was physically possible. The 1-inch punch became the most famous technique in martial arts history. People still study it today. Biomechanics researchers, physicists, martial artists from every discipline on Earth. They watch the footage frame by frame. They analyze the mechanics. They try to replicate the results. Most of them can't. Not because the technique is a secret. Lee explained it openly. It's because executing it requires a level of mind-body coordination that most human beings will never achieve. Bob Baker, the man who took the 1-inch punch at Long Beach in 1964, never forgot it. The pain in his chest lasted for days. He asked Lee never to use him for that demonstration again. Baker went on to appear as a villain in Lee's film Fist of Fury. He remained loyal to Lee for the rest of his life. Dan Inosanto, the young Filipino martial artist who had been skeptical when he first met Lee, became one of his most devoted students and closest friends. After Lee's death, Inosanto carried on teaching Jeet Kune Do. He's still teaching today. He's in his 80s, and he still talks about that first Long Beach demonstration with the kind of awe you'd expect from someone who witnessed a miracle. Vic Moore went on to have a remarkable career of his own. 4-time world karate champion. A pioneer as one of the first African-American martial artists to achieve major national recognition. He and Joe Louis introduced kickboxing to American television on The Merv Griffin Show in 1973. He opened karate schools across Ohio and North Carolina. He trained hundreds of students. He built a legacy that any fighter would be proud of. But for the rest of his life, he dealt with the same question over and over. What was it like? What was it like to stand in front of Bruce Lee and try to block his punch? Moore's answer always came back to the same thing. Speed. The man was just too fast. You could know exactly what he was going to do, exactly when he was going to do it, and you still couldn't stop him. It wasn't about style or technique. It was about a level of physical ability that existed beyond what anyone thought was possible. The footage from Long Beach still circulates today. You can find it on the internet. Grainy, shaky, shot from a distance. But even through the poor quality, you can see it. The moment Lee's fist fires. The moment Baker goes airborne. The moment Moore's hands don't even start to rise before Lee's punch is already there and gone. The footage is over 50 years old, and it still makes people stop and stare. Lee's legacy isn't just about fighting. It's about honesty. He gave an interview once, near the end of his life, with a Canadian journalist named Pierre Berton. It was one of the last major interviews he ever did. Berton asked him about the meaning of martial arts. Lee thought about it for a long moment and said that the hardest thing in the world was to express yourself honestly. Not to show off, not to perform, not to dazzle people with techniques you've memorized, but to be truthful about what you are and what you can do. He said that anyone could learn fancy techniques and impress a crowd. The real challenge was looking at yourself without lying, without pretending, without hiding behind style. That's what Long Beach was about. Not the flash, not the showmanship, not the spectacle that made crowds gasp and reporters scribble in their notebooks. The honesty. Lee stood in front of 8,000 skeptics and showed them exactly what he was. No exaggeration, no stage tricks, no compliant volunteers pretending to be overwhelmed. Just a man doing what he had trained his body to do and letting the results speak for themselves. The big man backstage. The one who challenged Lee and walked away silent. He understood something in that moment that all the skeptics eventually came to understand. You can doubt a claim. You can question a performance. You can dismiss a reputation. But you cannot argue with physics. You cannot argue with a force that knocks you into a wall before your brain has time to process what happened. Bruce Lee didn't need to convince anyone with words. He never did. That was the whole point of everything he built. From the very first punch at Long Beach to the very last scene he ever filmed, Lee's answer to doubt was always the same. Action. Pure, undeniable, unanswerable action. He didn't argue with skeptics. He didn't write essays defending his methods. He stood in front of them and he showed them. A fist stopped 1 inch from a man's chest. And from that 1 inch, a legend traveled around the entire world.